The first thing my brother said after the estate attorney finished reading the will was, "Well, I guess that settles it. You were always more her charity case than her granddaughter anyway." He didn't even look at me when he said it. He was already pulling on his jacket, already moving toward the door like the whole thing had been a minor errand, something to check off a list. My sister-in-law stood beside the window with her arms crossed, running a quiet calculation behind her eyes. She had been doing that all morning, ever since we sat down in the attorney's office, adding things up, subtracting people. I was still sitting in my chair, holding a coffee cup that had gone cold an hour ago, wearing the same black dress I had worn to my grandmother's funeral the day before. The Montana sky outside the window was the pale, washed-out gray that comes after a long cry. I remember thinking that even the weather knew something had broken. My brother paused in the doorway and looked back at me one last time. "You can come by the ranch for your things this weekend," he said. "We'll need the guest cottage by the end of the month." Then he left, and just like that, the place where I had grown up, the place where my grandmother had taught me everything I knew about hard work and quiet dignity, belonged to someone who had never once fixed a fence post in his life. But I'm getting ahead of myself. 3 days before all of this, I had stood at the edge of a frost-covered field in late November and watched them lower my grandmother into the ground. Her name was Eleanor May Sutton, though everyone in Clearwater County had called her Nana since before I was born. She was 81 years old when she passed, and until her final winter, she had still been out at dawn checking on the cattle with a thermos of coffee in one hand and a flashlight in the other. She was not a soft woman, not in the way people sometimes expect older women to be. She didn't fuss over things or offer comfort in a sugary way. When I was 9 and fell off a horse and came back crying to the house, she handed me a cold cloth for my scraped palm and said, "Roots hold longer than you think. Get back up." Then she walked me back out to the paddock herself. But in the mornings, when it was just the two of us before my brother woke up, she made sourdough biscuits in a cast-iron skillet that had belonged to her own mother. She poured coffee from a blue enamel pot and sat across from me at the kitchen table with the kind of patience I never found anywhere else. She asked about my students, remembered their names, asked follow-up questions the next time I visited. She listened the way people listen when they actually intend to think about what you've said. My parents had divorced when I was 6. What came after that was a long series of good intentions and missed weekends and explanations that made a certain kind of adult sense, but didn't help much when you were a child who just wanted someone to show up. My brother Marcus was 8 years older than me, and had always existed in a different universe, one with his own friends and his own grievances and very little patience for a younger sister who cried too easily and read too much. So, it was my grandmother who raised me. Not officially, not on any document, but in the way that actually counts. I spent every summer at the Sutton Ranch from the time I was 7 until I left for college. I spent holidays there. I called her every Sunday without being asked. When I graduated with my teaching degree and took a job at the elementary school in Clearwater, I moved into the small guest cottage on the property without either of us ever having a formal conversation about it. It simply made sense. For her and for me. Marcus visited a few times a year. He had moved to Bozeman in his 20s, married a woman named Dana who wore expensive boots that had never seen mud, and built a career in commercial real estate that he described as going extremely well in a tone that suggested it wasn't. He and my grandmother had a complicated relationship. She loved him, of course, but she had watched him grow into someone who valued the idea of things more than the reality of them. He liked the ranch as a concept, as a legacy, as something he could mention at dinner parties. He did not like the actual work of it. At the funeral, Marcus stood with a solemn expression and accepted condolences graciously. Dana wore a black coat that probably cost more than my monthly rent and held my brother's arm with the careful posture of someone performing grief rather than feeling it. People came to me throughout the day. Old neighbors and fellow teachers and members of the county fair committee my grandmother had chaired for 15 years. They all said some version of the same thing. "She talked about you all the time. She was so proud of how you turned out. She used to say you were the one who really understood her." I held on to those words through the rest of the day. Grief has a way of making you want to collect small kindnesses, store them somewhere safe against the cold. The will reading was scheduled for the following morning at the office of a man named Raymond Howell, who had handled my grandmother's legal affairs for nearly 20 years. He was a quiet, careful man with wire-rimmed glasses and the kind of stillness that comes from spending decades watching families fall apart over money. He offered water and coffee when we arrived. I took coffee. Marcus checked his phone. Mr. Howell opened the file and began reading. The ranch and all associated land, the cattle operation, the vehicles and equipment, the savings and investment accounts, a life insurance policy, the mineral rights on the east pasture that had been quietly accumulating value for years, all of it passed to Marcus as primary beneficiary. I heard the total figure mentioned in passing and felt the room shift slightly around me, the way air pressure changes before a storm. When he came to my name, there was a pause. A small, personal bequest. My grandmother's cast-iron skillet, her blue enamel coffee pot, a wooden box of letters she had saved from her own mother. A modest sum of money, clearly intended as something kind rather than something substantial. Marcus leaned back in his chair. Dana exhaled slowly through her nose in a way that managed to sound like satisfaction without technically being rude. I sat with my hands folded in my lap and tried to understand what I was feeling. It wasn't exactly what I would call surprise. My grandmother had always been private about money, and I had never asked. But there was something deeply disorienting about having a person's love for you be so clear in every way except the one that the rest of the world could see on paper. We walked out into the cold November air without much conversation. Marcus jingled his truck keys and said something to Dana about calling their contractor before the end of the week. Then he turned to me on the sidewalk and told me about the guest cottage. That evening, I drove back to the ranch alone and sat in my grandmother's kitchen for a long time. The biscuit pan was still on the stove from the last morning she had cooked. I hadn't been able to bring myself to put it away. The blue coffee pot sat on its shelf. Outside, the fields were going dark under a sky full of cold stars, and the cattle were quiet shapes moving slowly near the water trough. I thought about what she had said to me the last time I visited her in the hospital, 3 weeks before she died. She had been tired and her voice was thinner than I was used to, but her eyes were still sharp in that way she had, focused and direct. She had taken my hand and said, "I want you to read everything that comes out of that office very carefully, Claire. Don't let anyone skim over anything on your behalf." I had assumed she meant it the way older people sometimes mean things, as general advice, as a life principle. I pressed her hand and told her I would. Now, sitting in her kitchen with her coffee pot on the shelf and her cast-iron pan on the stove, I wasn't so sure that's what she had meant at all. 2 days later, my phone rang at 7 in the morning. It was Mr. Howell, and the first thing he said was, "Claire, I need to ask you something directly. After the reading the other day, did your brother and his wife ask you to leave the property?" I was standing at the small window in the guest cottage, watching frost melt off the fence rails in the early light. The question caught me completely off guard. "Yes," I said. "He told me to be out by the end of the month." There was a pause on the other end of the line, a long one. Then Mr. Howell said, quietly, "I see. That does clarify things considerably." I set my coffee down on the windowsill. "What do you mean?" He took a breath. "Claire, when your grandmother first drafted her estate documents several years ago, she made a specific request that I found somewhat unusual at the time." He paused again. She asked that a sealed secondary directive be attached to the primary will, with instructions that I was to wait 72 hours after the initial reading before contacting you, provided that certain conditions had occurred. My hand tightened slightly around the phone. "What conditions?" He spoke carefully. She described them as behavioral indicators. His tone was measured, but there was something underneath it, something that sounded almost like quiet admiration. "I think," he said, "she expected your brother to act exactly as he did." I looked out at the field where my grandmother had walked every morning of her adult life. The frost was almost gone now, and the grass had turned that deep winter amber it gets in late November, the color of old honey. "What's in the secondary directive?" I asked. Mr. Howell paused once more. "I think it would be best if you came to the office. There's quite a bit to go over, and I want you to have the full picture." "How soon?" I asked. He said, "As soon as you're comfortable." I said, "I'll be there in an hour." The drive into town took 35 minutes on the county road that ran along the edge of the Sutton property. I had driven it so many times I could have done it with my eyes closed. Past the old grain elevator, past the turnoff to the Hendersons' place, Past the big cottonwood my grandmother called the marker tree because she used to navigate by it when she was a girl and the road wasn't paved yet. I kept thinking about what Mr. Howell had said. Behavioral indicators. My grandmother had been a practical woman in every sense of the word. She did not do things without reasons. She did not leave gaps in her planning. I had watched her manage a working cattle operation through drought years and hard winters and market crashes that would have broken people with less spine. She had a saying she used whenever things got complicated. A good fence doesn't just keep cattle in. It keeps problems out before they start. She had lived by that in everything, not just ranching. Mr. Howell was already at his desk when I arrived. He stood when I came in, shook my hand, and gestured to the chair across from him. On the desk between us sat the same thick folder from the other day, and beside it, a separate envelope, cream-colored and sealed, with my grandmother's handwriting across the front. It said, "To be opened by Raymond Howell after 72 hours, if applicable." He let me look at it for a moment before speaking. "Your grandmother brought me this envelope 4 years ago," he said. "She told me she hoped she would never have occasion to use it, but that she wanted it prepared in the event that things unfolded in a particular way after her death." I looked at the envelope. "What's in it?" Mr. Howell opened it carefully and removed several pages. He slid the top sheet across the desk toward me. "It's called a conditional inheritance codicil," he said. "A legal addendum to the primary will." He let me read the heading before continuing. "The original bequest to your brother stood," he said, "but it was never unconditional." I began reading. The first paragraph established that the primary inheritance of the Sutton Ranch property and associated assets would pass to Marcus Allen Sutton as written. But the following section stopped me mid-breath. The inheritance was contingent on 3 obligations, to be upheld beginning from the date of transfer. The first condition stated that Claire Marie Sutton shall retain permanent right of residence at the Sutton Ranch property for as long as she wishes, and shall not be asked to vacate under any circumstances. I looked up. Mr. Howell gave a small nod. "Keep reading." The second condition, Claire Marie Sutton shall be consulted and included in all significant decisions related to the management and preservation of the ranch property and its operations. My chest felt like something was pressing against it from the inside. The third condition, the Eleanor Sutton Rural Education Scholarship Fund, established for graduating seniors of Clearwater County, shall be maintained in full and expanded according to the endowment schedule attached hereto. My grandmother had started that scholarship fund 8 years ago. She had funded it quietly out of her own savings, without announcing it or asking for recognition. 3 or 4 students from the county received it each year. She had attended every single award ceremony until she was too ill to drive. I reached the final section, the enforcement clause. If any of the above conditions are violated or deliberately disregarded by the primary beneficiary, full ownership of the Sutton Ranch, all associated land, livestock, equipment, and financial holdings shall transfer immediately and irrevocably to Claire Marie Sutton. I stopped reading. I sat there for several seconds. The clock on the wall behind Mr. Howell ticked steadily. Outside, a truck passed on the main street and the sound faded slowly into the cold morning. "She knew," I said finally. My voice came out quieter than I intended. Mr. Howell folded his hands. "Yes, I believe she did." I thought about the guest cottage, about my brother's voice on the sidewalk outside this very building, about the way Dana had stood at the window during the reading, calculating. "When Marcus told me to leave," I asked. "The moment he said that," Mr. Howell nodded slowly. "That constitutes a direct violation of the first condition." He paused. "And from what I understand, he has also not discussed the scholarship fund with you, or indicated any intention to continue it." I let out a long, slow breath. "So the ranch is mine. That is the legal position." "Yes." He pushed another document toward me. "This is the transfer certification. Your grandmother asked me to prepare it in advance against this contingency. Everything is already in order. I simply need your signature to initiate the filing." I looked at the document without touching it yet. What happens when my brother finds out? Mr. Howell's expression was careful, professional, but not without feeling. "He will be formally notified once the transfer is complete. At that point, as the legal owner, you will have full authority over who resides on and manages the property." I sat with that for a moment. The same authority my brother had used to put my bags at the door now sat quietly in my hands. "Did she leave anything else?" I asked. Any explanation? Mr. Howell opened the envelope again and removed a smaller folded note from behind the legal pages. My name was written on it in her familiar handwriting. She had written my name the same way my whole life. No flourishes, just clear, direct letters that meant what they said. She asked that you read it when you were ready, he said. I held it for a long moment before opening it. Claire, the note began, if you are reading this, then some things happened after I was gone that I suspected might happen. I am not angry about it, and I don't want you to be either. Not in the way that eats you up. I have watched your brother for a long time, and I want you to understand something clearly. He is not a cruel person. He is a careless one. And carelessness around the things that matter most is its own kind of failure. I swallowed and kept reading. I did not design this arrangement to punish him. I designed it to protect you, and to give him a fair opportunity to prove me wrong. If he had welcomed you and honored this place and kept faith with those scholarship students, then everything would have continued exactly as written. He had every chance. I looked out the window at the gray November street. But I have known for a long time what kind of test reveals a person, she wrote. It is not the test that asks them to be brave. It is the test that asks them to be generous when they don't have to be. That is the one that shows you who someone actually is. My throat tightened. You have always been the one who understood why this land matters, she continued. Not as money, not as status, as a living thing, as a responsibility, as a place where children grow up learning that work and loyalty mean something. That is what I want you to protect. The last paragraph was shorter. One more thing. When you have the power to make your brother feel what you felt this week, you will be tempted. I know you. I am asking you to pause before you act. Justice and cruelty can wear the same face, and only the person holding the decision can tell them apart. Choose the one you can live with for 50 years. Roots hold longer than you think. With all my love, Nana. I folded the note carefully and held it in both hands for a while without speaking. Mr. Howell waited. He had clearly done this before, sitting with families in the moment when everything reorganized itself. Finally, I looked up. I want to do this correctly, I said. No shortcuts. He nodded. That was your grandmother's preference as well. Then let's move forward. I signed the transfer document on a Wednesday morning. By Friday, the filing was complete with the county. Mr. Howell sent the formal notification to my brother that same afternoon, by certified mail to his address in Bozeman, and by email to the address on file. My brother called me at 6:15 that evening. I was in my grandmother's kitchen making dinner when the phone rang. I had moved back into the main house after leaving the guest cottage, not out of spite, but because it felt right to be there, in the place that smelled like her, surrounded by the things she had chosen and kept. I let it ring twice before answering. His voice came through tight and controlled, the way it gets when he is trying not to shout. What is this? It wasn't really a question. It's the rest of the will, I said. A pause. That is not possible. It was filed with the county this morning, I said. Mr. Howell can answer any legal questions you have. He was quiet for a long moment. Then, with the kind of effort that costs something, this is because I told you to take your things. Yes, another silence. She set us up. I looked at the cast iron pan on the stove, the blue coffee pot on its shelf, the frost starting to form on the dark kitchen window. No, I said. She gave you every opportunity to do the right thing. You made your own choice the same day we buried her. He didn't answer immediately. I continued, not unkindly but clearly. I'm not calling the lawyers. I'm not putting you out of anywhere. But I need you to come out here next week, and we need to talk about how this goes from here. A long pause. Then, quietly, you're serious. I have always been serious, I said. You just never paid attention. He came out the following Saturday. Dana stayed in Bozeman, which was probably the right call. He arrived in the late morning, drove his truck down the ranch road the same way he had for decades, parked near the barn the way you do when you've grown up somewhere and muscle memory still knows the right spot. I met him on the porch with 2 cups of coffee. He took one without saying anything and stood beside me looking out at the field. For a while, neither of us talked. The cattle moved slowly in the far pasture. A hawk turned wide circles over the creek. The sky was the pale winter blue that comes on clear, cold days, the kind that looks like it goes on forever. Finally he spoke. I had no idea about any of it. I believe you, I said. That was actually part of the problem. He looked at me sideways. What does that mean? It means you never asked. You came out here twice a year, sometimes 3 times, and you never once sat with her in the kitchen and asked about the scholarship fund or the operations or what she worried about at night. You knew the value of the land. You didn't know the value of the life on it. He was quiet for a moment. That landed. I could tell. Then he said, "You're not going to throw me out." It wasn't quite a question. More like someone carefully testing whether the ice would hold. "No," I said. "But I'm not going to pretend the last week didn't happen either." He turned the coffee cup slowly in his hands. "I handled it badly. You put my bags at the door the day after we buried her," I said. "I'm not going to tell you that was fine." He looked down. "No," he said quietly. "It wasn't." We stood there a little longer. Then I told him what I had decided. The ranch stays in my name. That is not something I am open to negotiating. He nodded, slowly. "The scholarship fund continues, and I will be managing it. I already spoke with the county school district about expanding the award this spring." He nodded again. "The East Cottage," I continued. "I'm going to renovate it as a proper guest space. You and Dana are welcome to use it when you visit, the way you always have. But visit means visit. It doesn't mean manage." He looked up at that. His expression had changed from the careful, controlled thing he had walked in wearing. There was something more honest underneath it now. Something that looked a little like the boy I barely remembered from before everything got complicated. "She was always smarter than I gave her credit for," he said finally. "She was the smartest person either of us ever knew," I said. He didn't argue with that. The months that followed were not a fairy tale. Families that have developed patterns over decades don't simply rearrange themselves because a legal document changes hands. There were awkward phone calls. There were moments when my brother said the wrong thing and I had to decide whether to respond or let it pass. There were moments when I missed my grandmother so acutely that the grief felt physical, like weather. But there were also mornings. Clear, cold mornings when I walked the same frost-covered fields she had walked, holding a thermos of coffee from the blue enamel pot, watching the cattle move in the early light. I started keeping the same biscuit recipe in the same cast-iron pan. I kept the wooden box of her mother's letters on the kitchen shelf. I kept her habits in the way that people keep pieces of someone they love, not as imitation but as continuation. The scholarship fund awarded 5 students that spring instead of 4. I attended the ceremony and read their names out loud the same way she had, clearly and without rushing, as if each name deserved its full moment. Afterward, a woman came up to me whose daughter had received the scholarship 2 years earlier and was now in her 2nd year of nursing school. She held my hands and said, "Your grandmother changed the whole direction of my daughter's life." I thanked her and meant it in a way that felt like the thanks were passing through me and landing somewhere else. My brother came out in April with Dana for a long weekend. It was better than I expected. Not seamlessly easy, not without effort, but genuinely better. He walked the east pasture with me on Saturday morning and asked real questions about the cattle operation, the kind of questions that come from actual curiosity rather than performed interest. Dana helped me plant a kitchen garden behind the main house, which I had not expected at all, and turned out to know more about tomatoes than I would have guessed. On the last evening before they left, my brother and I sat on the porch again the way we had in November. The spring air smelled like wet grass and thawing earth. The sky was going pink and gold over the mountains to the west. He said, "I've been thinking about something she used to say." "What's that?" He thought for a moment. "When I was a kid and I complained that something was hard, she would say something about roots. 'Roots hold longer than you think,' I said." He nodded. I never really understood what she meant by it. I looked out at the field, at the grass coming back up after the winter, at the creek catching the last light, at the fence posts standing exactly where they had always stood, through every season she had seen from this porch, and every season before her. "I think she meant that the things worth keeping," I said, "don't go anywhere just because the weather gets hard. You just have to stay close enough to notice when they come back." He was quiet for a while after that. Then he said, "You're more like her than I ever was." "I know," I said, and I was grateful for it every single day. The sun went down slow and red over the Clearwater Valley, the way it does in spring when the air is clean and the whole world smells like it's beginning again. I sat there until the last of the light was gone, And I thought about my grandmother, who had seen this same view for 60 years and somehow found a way to make sure it would still be tended after she was gone. The greatest thing she left me wasn't the land or the savings or the coffee pot or even the letters in their wooden box. It was the understanding that the life you build is only as lasting as the care you put into protecting it, not from the world, but from your own worst impulses when the world hands you a reason to stop being decent. She had trusted me to figure that out, and I had tried. I still try. Every morning when the frost is on the fence rails and the cattle are moving in the early light and the coffee pot is on the stove, I try. Stand steady, that's all she ever asked.